There are moments that change everything. Moments when the world reveals its hidden truths and we discover that love exists in places we never thought to look. Sometimes these moments arrive quietly, like autumn rain on window glass, and sometimes they crash into our lives with the force of thunder, splitting open everything we thought we knew about ourselves and those we love most. For Elena Martinez, that moment came on a gray October afternoon when she finally understood what her 8-year-old son had been hiding from her. It was the kind of day when the sky hung low and heavy, pregnant with unspoken storms, and the maple trees lining Riverside Elementary shed their golden leaves like tears. The air carried that particular scent of approaching winter, crisp and clean, tinged with the smoke from distant fireplaces and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. Elena had lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, ever since she and her late husband Carlos had bought the small blue house on Elm Street, with its white picket fence and overgrown rose garden. Back then, they had dreamed of filling the house with children's laughter, of birthday parties in the backyard, and Christmas mornings around a tree, heavy with ornaments collected over decades of married life. Cancer had stolen those dreams along with Carlos when Miguel was only 4, leaving Elena to navigate single motherhood in a world that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. But Miguel had been her anchor, her reason to keep moving forward when grief threatened to pull her under. From the moment he learned to walk, he had filled their home with a kind of boundless energy that made her believe in magic again. He was the child who brought home injured butterflies and cried when they had to trim the roses because he worried about the bees. He was the boy who insisted on saying goodnight to every stuffed animal in his room, and who still asked Elena to check for monsters under his bed, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to make sure any monsters that might be hiding there weren't lonely. Every day at 3:15, little Miguel would emerge from those red brick doors of Jefferson Elementary with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders and his sneakers scuffing the pavement in that particular way that children walk when their minds are lost in imaginary worlds. His dark hair would be tousled from recess, and there would usually be dirt under his fingernails from whatever adventure had captured his attention during lunch break. And every day, Elena would wait by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, counting the minutes until she heard his key turn in the lock and his voice calling out, "Mama, I'm home!" It was their ritual, as sacred and predictable as sunrise. Miguel would burst through the front door like a small hurricane, dropping his backpack in the hallway despite Elena's constant reminders about the coat closet. He would race to the kitchen where she waited with milk and cookies, chocolate chip on Mondays, oatmeal raisin on Tuesdays, snickerdoodles on Wednesdays. They would sit at the small wooden table that Carlos had built with his own hands, and Miguel would tell her about his day in the breathless, excited way that only children can manage, jumping from topic to topic like a butterfly sampling flowers. Mrs. Henderson taught us about volcanoes today, and did you know that some volcanoes can sleep for hundreds of years before they wake up? And Tommy Brennan lost his first tooth, and the tooth fairy gave him $5 whole. And can we get a hamster? Because Jessica's hamster had babies, and they're so tiny you could hold one in your hand. And Elena cherished these moments more than Miguel could possibly understand. In a life that had been carved hollow by loss, these afternoon conversations were the warm center that kept her world spinning. They were proof that joy could grow in the darkest soil, that love could multiply rather than divide when shared with the right person. But for 4 days in a row, the minutes stretched longer than they should have. 20 minutes longer. 20 minutes that felt like hours as Elena stood at that window, watching the street for any sign of her son's familiar figure. She found herself checking the clock obsessively, first glancing casually at the microwave display, then more frantically at her phone, calculating and recalculating the time it should take Miguel to walk home from school. The first day she told herself there must have been a fire drill or an assembly she'd forgotten about. Schools were always running late these days, and Miguel was probably just caught up in the usual chaos of dismissal. But when he finally appeared at the end of their street, walking slowly with his head down and his backpack dragging against the sidewalk, Elena felt a flutter of concern in her chest. The second day, when the same thing happened, the flutter became a flutter of genuine worry. Elena found herself pacing between the kitchen window and the front door, checking her phone for missed calls from the school, wondering if she should drive to Jefferson Elementary to make sure everything was all right. When Miguel finally came home, there was something different about him, something quiet and distant that she couldn't quite identify. By the third day, Elena was struggling to concentrate on anything else. She worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, and usually the afternoon hours when Miguel was at school were her most productive. But she found herself unable to focus on client projects, constantly checking the time and listening for the sound of his footsteps on the front porch. When he was late again, she felt her heart rate spike with a mother's primal anxiety. And when Miguel finally walked through that door on the fourth day, dirt smudged on his knees and something distant in his dark eyes, Elena felt the first whisper of worry crystallize into something more substantial. There was a secretiveness about him that she had never seen before, a way of not quite meeting her eyes that set off every maternal alarm she possessed. "Mijo, why are you getting home so late? Did something happen at school? Are you feeling okay?" Miguel paused in the doorway, his small hand still gripping the doorknob as if he might need to make a quick escape. For a moment, Elena saw something flicker across his face. Fear, perhaps, or guilt, or something she couldn't quite name. Then his expression smoothed into the carefully innocent look that children master when they're trying to avoid getting in trouble. "I just stopped to say hello to the husky mama. You know, the one that belongs to the Garcias next door. Storm is so beautiful, and he gets lonely during the day when Mr. and Mrs. Garcia are at work." Elena felt her shoulders relax slightly. Of course. The explanation was so simple, so perfectly reasonable. Miguel had always been drawn to animals the way flowers are drawn to sunlight. When he was 6, he had spent an entire summer trying to befriend a family of stray cats that lived behind the grocery store, bringing them scraps of food and speaking to them in the gentle, patient voice he used with all creatures. It made perfect sense that he would be enchanted by the Garcias' magnificent Siberian husky. Sa, that beautiful dog. But don't stay too long, okay? I worry when you're not home. And make sure you ask Mr. and Mrs. Garcia before you pet Storm. We want to be respectful neighbors. Miguel nodded eagerly, perhaps a little too eagerly, and then he was off to his room to change out of his school clothes, leaving Elena alone in the kitchen with her coffee and her gradually settling nerves. It was such a simple explanation, so innocent and believable that Elena felt foolish for having worried at all. The Garcias did have a magnificent Siberian husky named Storm, with ice blue eyes and a coat like fresh snow. She had admired the dog herself many times during their brief conversations over the back fence. Storm was gentle and well-trained, the kind of dog that children dream about having as a companion. Of course, her animal-loving son would want to spend time with such a creature. But sometimes the most innocent explanations hide the deepest truths. 2 days later, Elena found herself chatting with Mrs. Garcia over the back fence while hanging laundry on the line. It was one of those perfect October afternoons when the air was crisp, but the sun was warm, and the maple tree in their backyard was putting on a spectacular show of gold and crimson. Mrs. Garcia was tending to her prize-winning roses, carefully pruning the last blooms of the season before the first frost arrived. Elena had always admired Maria Garcia's way with plants. The older woman had emigrated from Mexico nearly 30 years ago, and she had brought with her not only a wealth of gardening knowledge, but also an endless supply of wisdom about raising children and navigating life's unexpected challenges. Elena often found herself seeking out these casual conversations, drawn to Maria's gentle strength and the way she listened without judgment. "Oh, Elena, I meant to tell you earlier, we had to take Storm to my sister's house this whole week. Her dog passed away, and she's been so lonely without him. Storm is such good company. He has this way of sensing when people need comfort. My sister lives alone since her husband died, and I thought having Storm around might help her through the worst of the grief." Elena's hand stilled on the pillowcase she was hanging, a cold feeling beginning to spread through her chest like ice water. This whole week? But Miguel said he's been visiting Storm after school. I thought that was why he was coming home late." Maria's weathered face creased with confusion, her dark eyes reflecting genuine concern. "That's strange, dear. Storm hasn't been here since last Sunday morning. We drove him to Albuquerque that evening. He won't be back until next weekend at the earliest." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and making her hands tremble as she gripped the fence post for support. If Storm wasn't here, if he hadn't been here all week, then where had Miguel been going? What had he been doing in those missing 20 minutes each day? And more frightening than either of those questions was the simple, terrible fact that her son, her honest, trusting boy, who had never told her a lie in his 8 years of life, had been deliberately deceiving her. In that moment, Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not anger, not fear exactly, but something deeper and more complex. A mixture of confusion, hurt, and a growing dread that made her mouth dry and her heart race. The realization that her son, her truthful, gentle boy, had been lying to her felt like a fundamental shift in the universe, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly revealed itself to be less solid than she had believed. And if he wasn't visiting Storm, then where had he been going? What had he been doing in those missing 20 minutes each day? Elena's mind immediately leaped to all the terrible possibilities that haunted every parent's nightmares. Was someone hurting him? Had he fallen in with the wrong crowd of older kids? Was he getting into trouble at school and too ashamed to tell her? Or worse, and this thought made her stomach clench with terror, was there someone who had approached him? Someone who had told him to keep secrets from his mother? Elena tried to keep her voice steady as she thanked Maria for the information and made some excuse about needing to get back inside. But as she walked across her backyard, past the swing set that Carlos had built for Miguel when he was 3, past the small vegetable garden where they grew tomatoes and peppers together each summer, Elena felt as if she were moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. That night, Elena barely slept. She lay in her bed listening to Miguel's quiet breathing from the next room, through the thin walls of their small house, and wondered what secrets lived behind his peaceful expression. She found herself remembering every interaction from the past week, searching for clues she might have missed, signs that should have told her something was wrong. Had Miguel seemed different lately, more withdrawn, perhaps, or preoccupied? She thought about his behavior at dinner the night before, how he had pushed his food around on his plate and responded to her questions about school with one-word answers. At the time, she had attributed it to tiredness or the natural moodiness that seemed to be emerging as he grew older. But now she wondered if there had been something else, something she should have recognized. Elena thought about all the terrible possibilities that filled a mother's mind in the dark, hours before dawn. She imagined predators and bullies, accidents and kidnapping attempts. She pictured Miguel hurt and alone somewhere, too frightened or ashamed to ask for help. But alongside the fear, she also remembered the gentleness in his voice when he had spoken about the husky, the way his eyes had lit up with something pure and caring. Whatever secret Miguel was keeping, Elena found herself hoping desperately that it was born of love rather than fear. The house felt different that night, charged with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to seep into the very walls. Elena found herself getting up repeatedly to check on Miguel, standing in his doorway and watching the rise and fall of his chest beneath his Star Wars comforter. In the pale light filtering through his bedroom window, he looked so young, so innocent, that Elena felt her heart clench with protective love. This was the child who still insisted on kissing every one of his stuffed animals goodnight, who cried when they had to trim the rose bushes because he worried about disturbing any creatures that might be living there. This was the boy who had spent his own allowance money to buy food for the stray cats behind the grocery store, who had once brought home a butterfly with a damaged wing and begged Elena to help them nurse it back to health. Whatever Miguel was hiding, Elena couldn't believe it was anything truly harmful. But the not knowing was torture. When morning came, pale and gray with the promise of rain, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She called in sick to work, something she rarely did, and spent the morning pacing her small house like a caged animal. She cleaned the kitchen twice, reorganized Miguel's bookshelf, and folded the same load of laundry 3 times before finally admitting to herself that she couldn't concentrate on anything except the question that was eating away at her peace of mind. She had to know where Miguel was going. She had to understand what was happening to her son. Elena dressed carefully that afternoon, choosing dark clothes that would help her blend into shadows and comfortable shoes that would allow her to move quietly. She felt ridiculous, like a character in one of the spy novels she sometimes read before bed, but the maternal need to protect Miguel override any embarrassment she might have felt about following her own child. She waited until 3 o'clock, then positioned herself across the street from Jefferson Elementary, partially hidden behind a large oak tree that provided both shade and camouflage. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone within a block could hear it, and her palms were damp with nervous sweat despite the cool autumn air. When the dismissal bell rang and children began pouring out of the red brick building, Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. She spotted Miguel immediately. There was no mistaking his small figure or the way his dark hair caught the afternoon light. He walked slowly, more slowly than usual, and there was something contemplative about his posture that made Elena's chest tight with emotion. When Miguel emerged with the other children, she began to follow, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice her, close enough that she wouldn't lose him. It felt like the most unnatural thing in the world, this careful surveillance of her own child. But Elena forced herself to maintain the distance, even when every instinct screamed at her to run to him and demand answers. Miguel walked his usual route for several blocks, past the corner market where they sometimes stopped for ice cream, past the small park where he had learned to ride his bicycle without training wheels. Elena began to relax slightly, thinking perhaps he was heading home after all, and had simply taken a longer route for reasons of his own. But then, just as Elena expected him to turn toward their street, Miguel veered left into a narrow alley she had never noticed before. An alley where the afternoon shadows fell thick and heavy, where weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and old chain-link fences stood rusted and forgotten. It was the kind of place that parents warned their children to avoid, the kind of place where broken glass glittered among the fallen leaves, and graffiti marked the walls like territorial declarations. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she crept closer, every instinct telling her to call out to her son to pull him away from whatever waited in that forgotten place. The rational part of her mind was screaming that this was exactly the kind of dangerous situation she had feared, that Miguel was putting himself at risk in ways he couldn't possibly understand. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the careful way Miguel moved, without fear, with purpose. There was something in his posture that suggested familiarity, as if he had walked this path many times before. And despite her terror, Elena found herself curious about what could draw her cautious, safety-conscious son into such a place. The alley was longer than it appeared from the street, winding between the backs of old buildings and ending in a small clearing behind what looked like an abandoned auto repair shop. Rusted car parts were scattered among the weeds, and an old chain-link fence separated the clearing from the industrial buildings beyond. It was the kind of place that urban wildlife might use as shelter, the kind of forgotten corner where feral cats might make their homes, or where homeless individuals might seek temporary refuge from the elements. And then Elena saw them, and her entire world shifted on its axis. There, in a small clearing behind what looked like an abandoned auto repair shop, her 8-year-old son knelt beside a creature that should have terrified him. A wolf, larger than any dog Elena had ever seen, with fur the color of storm clouds and eyes that held both wildness and an ancient, weary pain. The animal was magnificent even in its suffering, its coat thick and lustrous, despite the dirt and debris that clung to it, its frame powerful, even as it lay helplessly on its side. The wolf's left hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and Elena could see where infection had begun to set in around what appeared to be an old injury. Flies buzzed around the wound, and the smell of sickness carried on the afternoon breeze. It was clear that this beautiful creature had been here for some time, trapped by injury and unable to hunt or find water on its own. But what took Elena's breath away wasn't the wolf itself. It was the scene unfolding before her eyes. Miguel had created what could only be described as a sanctuary in this forgotten place. He had arranged small plastic containers of water within the wolf's reach, and Elena could see where he had brought an old towel from home to make the animal more comfortable. There were crackers scattered on a paper plate, and what looked like pieces of lunch meat carefully placed where the wolf could reach them without having to move its injured leg. Most remarkably, the wolf was accepting this care with a calm trust that defied everything Elena thought she knew about wild animals. This was a predator that should have been dangerous, a creature that should have seen humans as threats. Instead, it lay quietly as Miguel gently checked its water bowl and spoke to it in soft, reassuring tones. "I know it hurts, friend, but you have to eat something. Please, just a little bit. I brought you some of the good turkey from my sandwich today. Mama always packs extra because she says growing boys need lots of protein, but I think you need it more than I do right now." Elena watched, transfixed, as this injured wild animal, this predator that should have been dangerous, accepted food from her child's hands with the gentleness of an old friend. There was something almost mystical about the scene, something that challenged every assumption Elena had about the relationship between humans and wild creatures. She could see that Miguel had been visiting this wolf for days, maybe even weeks. There was a familiarity between them that spoke of routine, of trust, built over time. Miguel moved around the animal with confidence, never making sudden movements or loud noises, always approaching from where the wolf could see him coming. And the wolf, despite its pain and weakness, seemed to recognize Miguel's voice, its ears perking up slightly when the boy spoke. As Elena continued to watch, she saw Miguel carefully examine the wolf's injured leg without actually touching it. Even at 8 years old, he seemed to understand that the animal was in pain and that any unnecessary contact might cause more harm. Instead, he spoke to the wolf in the same gentle voice he used with injured butterflies or frightened cats. "I wish I could make it stop hurting. I looked it up on the school computer, and I know that wolves are really strong and heal fast, but your leg looks pretty bad. I don't know what to do to help you more, but I promise I'll keep coming back until you're better." Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son, her beautiful, compassionate boy, showing more wisdom and courage than most adults would in such a situation. He wasn't just feeding this animal out of pity or curiosity. He was genuinely caring for it, taking responsibility for its well-being in a way that demonstrated a depth of character Elena hadn't fully recognized before. Miguel had clearly been doing research about wolves, probably during computer time at school or at the library. He had figured out what kind of food would be appropriate, how much water the animal would need, and how to approach it safely. For a child who had never been allowed to have so much as a goldfish because of Elena's concerns about responsibility and commitment, Miguel was showing remarkable dedication and maturity. But even as pride swelled in Elena's chest, fear clutched at her heart. This was a wild animal, injured and potentially unpredictable. What if the wolf turned on Miguel? What if other people discovered this place and reacted with violence toward the animal? What if Miguel was accused of somehow harming the wolf, or of interfering with wildlife in ways that could get him in serious trouble? In that moment, Elena understood with crystal clarity why Miguel hadn't told her about the wolf. Her son knew her well enough to predict that her first reaction would be fear. Fear for his safety, fear of the legal implications, fear of the unknown. Miguel had been protecting both himself and the wolf by keeping this secret, but Elena could see that the burden of that protection was weighing heavily on his young shoulders. As she continued to observe, Elena noticed other details that spoke to Miguel's careful planning. He had brought a small notebook where he seemed to be keeping track of what the wolf ate and how much water it drank. There was a watch on his wrist, an old digital watch that had belonged to his father, and Elena realized that Miguel was timing his visits to ensure he didn't stay too long and worry her. The level of thought and preparation that had gone into these visits was astounding. Miguel had clearly established a routine that allowed him to care for the wolf while still maintaining the appearance of normalcy at home. He had been sacrificing his own lunch, probably going hungry at school so that he could bring food to this creature that needed it more desperately than he did. I wish I could take you home, but Mama would be scared. She's already lost Daddy, and she worries about everything now, but I promise I'll come back tomorrow, okay? I'll always come back. I won't let you be alone. The words hit Elena like a physical blow because they revealed not only Miguel's understanding of the wolf's suffering, but also his awareness of her own grief and fear. Even at 8 years old, Miguel was conscious of how Carlos's death had changed their family dynamic, how it had made Elena more protective and more anxious about losing the people she loved. Elena had thought she had been hiding her lingering grief from Miguel, protecting him from the full weight of her sorrow. But clearly her son understood more than she had given him credit for. He knew that bringing home an injured wolf would terrify her, not just because of the practical dangers, but because she couldn't bear the thought of losing him too. The wolf made a small, grateful noise as Miguel refilled its water bowl, and Elena saw something extraordinary pass between them. For just a moment, the wild amber eyes of the predator met the dark brown eyes of the child, and there was communication there that transcended species. It was a look of mutual respect, of understanding, of connection that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Miguel carefully arranged the remaining food where the wolf could reach it easily, then sat back on his heels and simply spent time in the animal's presence. He didn't try to pet it or force interaction. He simply shared space with this magnificent creature, offering the comfort of companionship to an animal that was far from its own kind and suffering alone. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she watched this scene unfold. Her son, her beautiful, compassionate boy, was showing more wisdom and courage than most adults would in such a situation. He wasn't just feeding this animal. He was loving it, caring for it, being present with it in its pain. And he was doing all of this while carrying the emotional burden of secrecy, while sacrificing his own comfort and safety, while managing complex logistics that would challenge many adults. As Elena stood there in the shadows, watching her son tend to this injured wolf with such tenderness and dedication, she felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of who Miguel was. She had always known he was kind and gentle, but this went beyond kindness. This was compassion in its purest form. Love without expectation of reward, care without hope of recognition. Miguel was demonstrating virtues that Elena wished more adults possessed. The ability to see suffering and respond with action rather than avoidance. The courage to take responsibility for something vulnerable and dependent. The wisdom to approach a dangerous situation with respect rather than fear. In caring for this wolf, Miguel was becoming the kind of person Elena had always hoped he would grow up to be. But even as these realizations washed over her, Elena knew she couldn't remain hidden any longer. The wolf needed professional medical care that Miguel couldn't provide, no matter how dedicated he was. And Miguel needed to understand that there were resources available to help in situations like this, that he didn't have to carry this burden alone. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped forward into the clearing, making her presence known. Miguel? Miguel turned at the sound of his name, and Elena watched as a complex array of emotions flickered across his young face. Surprise, fear, shame, and something that might have been relief. For a moment, he looked like he might try to run, but then his shoulders sagged with the weight of his secret finally being discovered. Mama, I can explain. Please don't be mad. He's hurt, and he needs help, and I couldn't just leave him here alone. I know you said we can't have pets because we're not ready for the responsibility, but this is different. He was already here, and he was dying, and I had to do something. Elena moved slowly into the clearing, conscious of the wolf's wariness as a stranger entered its safe space. The animal's ears flattened slightly and its muscles tensed, but it didn't try to flee. Whether this was due to its injuries or its trust in Miguel, Elena couldn't be sure. Oh, Mijo, what have you found? For several minutes, mother and son knelt together in that forgotten place, watching this wild creature that had somehow become part of their story. Elena could see now that the wolf was severely dehydrated and weak, that its injured leg was infected and needed immediate medical attention. But she could also see the intelligence in its amber eyes, the dignity it maintained even in its suffering. "Miguel, this wolf needs more help than you can give him. We need to call someone who knows about wild animals, someone who can make sure he gets the medical care he needs." "But what if they take him away? What if they hurt him? What if they say I did something wrong by feeding him?" Elena reached out and gently touched her son's shoulder, feeling the tension in his small frame. "There are people whose job it is to help animals like this, sweetheart. Wildlife veterinarians and rescue workers who understand wild creatures and want to see them healthy and free. They won't hurt him, and they certainly won't blame you for being kind." "Are you sure? Promise me they won't just put him to sleep because he's injured." "I promise that we'll make sure he goes to people who will do everything they can to help him heal." Elena pulled out her phone and, after a quick internet search, found the number for the State Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. As she made the call, Miguel sat beside the wolf, speaking to it in quiet, reassuring tones, explaining what was about to happen, and promising that the people who were coming would help. Within an hour, the alley that had harbored this secret was filled with gentle professionals who understood wild things and broken creatures. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead wildlife veterinarian, arrived with a team of specialists who moved with calm efficiency, clearly experienced in handling situations like this. Elena watched as they carefully examined the wolf, their movements respectful and their voices soft. They sedated the animal gently, talking Miguel through each step of the process so he would understand that they were helping, not harming. As they worked, Dr. Chen explained that the wolf appeared to be a young male, probably around 2 years old, who had likely been hit by a car and then managed to drag himself to this secluded spot. "You know what, young man? You probably saved this wolf's life. He's been injured for at least a week, maybe longer, and without the food and water you brought him, he might not have survived. You showed remarkable courage and compassion." "Really? He's going to be okay?" "With proper medical care and time to heal, he should make a full recovery. His leg will need surgery, and he'll need antibiotics for the infection, but wolves are incredibly resilient. Once he's healed, we'll be able to release him back into a protected wilderness area where he belongs. Can I visit him while he's getting better?" Dr. Chen smiled at Miguel's eager question. "We don't usually allow visitors in our rehabilitation facility because we want to keep the animals as wild as possible. But in this case, I think we can make an exception. This wolf owes you his life, and I think he'd benefit from seeing a friendly face during his recovery." As they loaded the wolf into the specialized transport vehicle, Elena saw something extraordinary happen. The sedated animal, despite his medication, seemed to lift his great head slightly and look directly at Miguel. For just a moment, those wild amber eyes held her son's gaze, and Elena could swear she saw gratitude there. A wordless acknowledgement of the debt the wolf owed to this small human who had refused to let him suffer alone. That evening, as Elena and Miguel sat together on the couch in their small living room, the weight of the day's revelations hung between them. Elena had called Miguel's school to report that he would be late the next morning. They had a wildlife rehabilitation center to visit and some very important conversations to finish. "Miguel, why didn't you tell me about the wolf? You know you can tell me anything, right? We're a team, you and I. We're supposed to face things together." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes focused on his hands folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was small but thoughtful. "I was afraid you'd say it was too dangerous, and I was afraid that if grown-ups knew about him, they might hurt him or take him somewhere bad. I've seen movies where animals get put in cages or, worse, I couldn't let that happen to him." Elena felt her heart clench at the weight of responsibility her 8-year-old son had been carrying. "Do you understand now that there are grown-ups whose job is to help animals, people who care about them just as much as you do?" Dr. Chen was really nice, and she promised to send us pictures when he's all better. She said maybe we could even be there when they release him back to the wild. Elena pulled Miguel closer, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and feeling grateful beyond words that her son was safe, that the wolf would be cared for, and that this crisis had revealed depths of character in Miguel that filled her with pride. "I'm proud of you, Mijo. What you did was incredibly brave and kind, but next time something like this happens, and I hope there will be a next time, because the world needs people like you, we'll handle it together, okay? No more secrets. No more carrying these big responsibilities all by yourself." "Okay, Mama, I promise." As the days turned into weeks, Elena watched Miguel's anxiety gradually transform into excitement as regular updates arrived from Dr. Chen. The wolf's surgery had been successful, his infection was clearing up, and his strength was returning. The rehabilitation center sent photos and videos showing the wolf's progress. First tentative steps on his healing leg, then confident movement around his enclosure, and finally, powerful leaps and runs that demonstrated his full recovery. Miguel printed every photo and created a scrapbook documenting the wolf's journey from injury to health. He wrote captions for each image, telling the story of their friendship and the wolf's remarkable recovery. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was so impressed by Miguel's dedication and the story behind it that she arranged for Dr. Chen to visit their class and talk about wildlife conservation. The presentation was a huge success. Dr. Chen brought photos and videos of the wolves and other animals at the rehabilitation center, and she told the class about the important work they did to help injured wildlife. But the highlight of her presentation was the story of Miguel and the wolf, which she told with genuine admiration for the boy's courage and compassion. Miguel's classmates were amazed by his story. Some had difficulty believing that their quiet, thoughtful classmate had been secretly caring for a wild wolf, but the evidence was undeniable. Miguel became something of a local celebrity, with his story spreading throughout the school and then into the wider community. When Dr. Chen shared Miguel's story with local news outlets, it spread like wildfire across social media. The video of an 8-year-old boy risking his safety to care for an injured wolf touched hearts around the world. News crews came to interview Miguel and Elena, and their small blue house on Elm Street became the center of attention that felt surreal to both of them. Comments poured in from thousands of people who saw in Miguel's actions something pure and hopeful about humanity. The story was shared on platforms around the globe, translated into dozens of languages, and featured on international news programs. Elena was amazed by the number of people who reached out to share their own stories of childhood compassion or to express gratitude for Miguel's example. One comment that particularly touched Elena read, "This is what compassion looks like in its purest form." This child saw a creature in pain and didn't think about danger or inconvenience or the opinions of others. He just saw life that needed saving, and he acted. If we all had even a fraction of this boy's courage and kindness, the world would be a very different place. Another commenter wrote, "Children understand love in ways that adults forget. They don't see predator and prey, human and animal, us and them. They just see a soul that needs help, and they respond with their whole hearts." Miguel has reminded all of us what it means to be truly human. The response was so overwhelming that Elena initially worried about the impact on Miguel. But she quickly realized that her son was handling the attention with the same quiet thoughtfulness he brought to everything else. He was pleased that people were inspired by his story, but he was more excited about the educational opportunities it created. 3 months after the wolf's rescue, Elena and Miguel received the call they had been waiting for. The wolf was fully healed and ready to be released back into the wild. Dr. Chen invited them to witness the release, which would take place in a protected forest preserve about 2 hours from their city. The drive to the preserve was filled with excitement and anticipation. Miguel had prepared for this day by reading everything he could find about wolf behavior and habitat requirements. He had dozens of questions for Dr. Chen about where the wolf would go, how he would find his pack, and whether he would remember the kindness he had received during his recovery. The release site was a beautiful meadow surrounded by dense forest, with a clear stream running through it and abundant wildlife sign indicating a healthy ecosystem. Dr. Chen explained that this area was home to a small but stable wolf population, and that their patient would have the best possible chance of finding others of his kind. When they opened the transport crate, the wolf emerged slowly, cautiously surveying his new environment. He was magnificent, his coat gleaming with health, his injured leg now strong and sure beneath him. For a moment, he stood still at the edge of the meadow, and Elena could swear he was testing the wind, reading the stories it carried about this new territory. Then the wolf looked directly at Miguel, and for just a moment, the two locked eyes across the meadow. Elena felt her breath catch as she witnessed this final communication between the boy and the creature he had saved. There was recognition there, gratitude, and something that might have been a farewell. "Look, Mama, look how beautiful he is. Look how free." And then the wolf was gone, disappearing into the forest with powerful, graceful strides that spoke of joy and wild freedom. Miguel watched until the last glimpse of gray fur vanished among the trees, and then he turned to Elena with tears of happiness streaming down his face. He's home now. He's really home. The story didn't end with the wolf's release. If anything, that moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in Miguel's life. Dr. Chen offered him a position as a junior volunteer at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and Miguel threw himself into the work with characteristic dedication. Every Saturday, he helped care for injured birds, orphaned foxes, baby deer, and other wild creatures who needed a second chance. Elena watched with pride as Miguel developed relationships with the veterinary staff and learned about wildlife biology, conservation, and the complex challenges facing wild animals in an increasingly developed world. His compassion, which had once worried her because she feared it made him vulnerable, proved to be his greatest strength. Miguel's story inspired the creation of a youth wildlife conservation program that connected children with local rehabilitation centers and environmental organizations. The program, which started in their city, expanded to include schools across the state and eventually became a model for similar initiatives around the country. "Miguel has taught all of us something important," Dr. Chen said during a television interview 6 months after the wolf's release. "Sometimes the greatest acts of conservation come not from scientists or policymakers, but from a child who simply refuses to walk away from suffering." Miguel saw a creature in need and responded with love. That's the foundation of all meaningful conservation work. Elena often found herself reflecting on how much their lives had changed since that gray October afternoon when she had followed Miguel into the alley. Her fears about his sensitivity and compassion had been transformed into recognition of these qualities as superpowers that could change the world. "I used to worry about Miguel being too sensitive, too trusting," Elena confided to Maria Garcia one afternoon as they worked together in their gardens. "I thought his tender heart would make him an easy target for people who might take advantage of his kindness. Now I realize that his compassion isn't a weakness. It's his greatest gift." The wolf's story became a legend in their community. Children at Miguel's school talked about the boy who saved a wolf, and many of them became involved in conservation efforts of their own. The alley where Miguel had first found the wolf was cleaned up and turned into a small community garden, with a plaque commemorating the friendship between a boy and a wild creature that had taught an entire community about the power of compassion. A year after the wolf's release, Elena and Miguel returned to the forest preserve for a memorial visit. They hiked the trails where the wolf now roamed free, and Miguel left a small pile of stones at the edge of the meadow where they had said goodbye. It was his way of honoring the friendship that had changed his life and, in many ways, had changed him from a child into someone who understood his place in the larger web of life. As they sat by the stream in the gathering dusk, watching for any sign of wildlife, Miguel spoke quietly about what the experience had taught him. "I think animals know when you're trying to help them. They can feel it in your heart. And if we all just helped a little bit, if we all paid attention to the creatures around us who need kindness, imagine how much better the world would be." Elena looked at her son, no longer the little boy who had walked into that alley, but a young person with a deep understanding of compassion and responsibility, and felt her heart swell with pride. Miguel had learned lessons about courage, dedication, and love that would serve him for the rest of his life. But more than that, he had become a teacher for everyone who heard his story. And somewhere in the protected forest around them, a gray wolf ran free through autumn leaves, carrying with him the memory of a small boy who had seen beyond fear to the simple truth that every life has value. Sometimes late at night, when the wind was just right, Elena imagined she could hear the wolf's song echoing across the preserve, a wild, beautiful sound that spoke of freedom, gratitude, and the enduring power of love. Sometimes the most powerful forces for change come in the smallest packages. Sometimes wisdom wears the face of a child. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to witness the moment when pure compassion meets wild need, and magic happens. Miguel's story reminded the world that heroism doesn't always wear a cape